This question is from an anonymous audience member who asks, what would it take for the Labour Party to turn around and offer a centre-left policy platform? Better public services, higher public sector pay, wealth taxes such as land value taxation, trans rights, support for refugees. How can progressives get a government that represents them? So clearly the questioner is frustrated because they feel that the Labour government isn't representing those kind of progressive policies and values. George, what do you make of, first of all, the sort of premise of the question?
I would disagree with the broad premise because I think in many ways this is a classically centre-left government. It just doesn't always seem like it. So on policy, let's look at what they've done. They increased taxes by over 40 billion in the budget. They increased public spending by over 100 billion, with 9 billion of that going on a higher public sector pay. In terms of wealth taxes, they've abolished non-dom status. They've increased capital gains tax.
They're taxing private schools.
They're taxing private schools. They're taxing private jets. They're taxing large farms and family businesses through inheritance tax. So I think if those perhaps had been sold in more populist terms, then maybe they would have cut through more. In other areas, there are obviously differences of substance. Immigration, although I think the policy is actually softer than some of the rhetoric suggests. Some progressives won't have liked the big cuts in foreign aid. Certainly wouldn't have liked the now U-turned welfare cuts. But I think if you look at what defines government, and broadly it's your approach to the economy and public services, then this is in line with past sort of centre-left Labour administrations.
I think that's true. But what this person seems to be quite concerned about is how vocal Labour is about supporting minority groups. Like they've mentioned trans rights and they've mentioned support for refugees as well. Rachel, does it matter? Does that language matter in terms of either putting off or attracting those progressive voters, like our questioner who might be feeling left taken for granted?
Yeah, it definitely does matter. And I think there has been a consensus, an assumption in on the part of the government that people broadly on the progressive left will, when it comes to it, vote Labour regardless because there isn't an alternative. We'll come back to that. And therefore, it doesn't matter if they use rhetoric that is alienating because they're reaching out for voters in the centre and on the right, and on the left, those voters will come to them when it matters. Now, obviously, as we've spoken about a lot this summer, there are alternatives on the left. We've got the Green leadership contest, the results of which are out in a week and a half. And we've also got this new left-wing party, as yet unnamed, Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana. And it's really interesting that when George first reported on broad speculative support, this is before Zara Sultana had announced that she was quitting Labour, you had some exclusive polling that said 10%, right? And that was the beginning of June-ish. And new Ipsos polling from this week that I've written up now puts that at 20%. So there clearly is a substantial subsection of the left that really is put off by either the language, the rhetoric, Islander strangers, the slight demonising of minority groups, or at least the lack of standing up for minority groups that they would associate with the progressive Labour government, or more generally the wider economic policy. I think George is absolutely right that there is definitely a way to sort of look at everything that Labour has done and put it in a framework that actually is quite centre-left and quite progressive, but they never talk about it that way. They only talk about it in the kind of, we're doing this because we have to do it, or there's been a sort of a lack of joining the dots and saying this is what a centre-left government looks like. And it is clear that voters on the left are getting fed up by it. So in answer to the question, what would it take for the Labour Party to turn around and offer this policy platform? Well, maybe what would it take for them to talk about it in those terms? Maybe the very real threat of losing voters to the left that we've seen become a reality this summer is part of the answer to that question.
Yeah, and I suppose, there is a way of talking about it. There's a way of saying we're about jobs, we're about housing, we're about public services, and they've got stories to tell on each of those things. The Employment Rights Bill is coming up, Renters' Rights Bill, and then you've got the house building target as well on that housing aspect of it. And then in terms of improving public services, NHS waiting lists are coming down, there are more appointments coming up. up. So they do have a story to tell, but I feel like you're right. They never really join those dots. I mean, if I were them, I'd just be saying it over and over again. Maybe they are, but it's not cutting through all the other noise that we've had over the summer.
Well, they listen to the New Statesman podcast, so here's some free comms advice.
Yeah. And so we've got another question that actually is very similar to the first. This question is from an anonymous listener, and they ask, why do Labour prioritise voters who seem to hate them and progressive values? It feels like the government are slow running the Lib Dem coalition car crash. Telling your voters to grow up and accept that government means forgetting your values doesn't seem to have a history of paying off. So this, I think we can focus more here on kind of the electoral calculation. You know, how wise is it for Labour to take those progressive voters for granted, even if, you know, in policy terms, as we've spoken about, it's more complicated than that, in an attempt to try and attract a broader church, you know, from the centre and from the right, and trying to stop losing voters to reform, for example?
Yes, well, I think Labour strategists would say, look, the electorate as a whole is in a different place to, say, progressive activists on issues such as immigration, you know, foreign aid cuts. Some of the things which have been most unpopular amongst progressives have been very popular amongst the electorate at large. I think it obviously gets into thornier territory when you look at results and the polling. And at the moment, Labour are losing more votes to the Lib Dems and Greens than they are to Reform. And the risk is that the left-wing vote fragments further with a new left party. And that Reform consolidates the right-wing votes around it. But I think you can already see a bit of a shift from Keir Starmer. I think at one of the last PLP meetings before the summer recess, he said to MPs that we will fight Reform as Labour. Now, I think that was a way of saying we are not engaged in the business of simply chasing Nigel Farage's tail. And there's a charge that Number 10 very much pushes back on, pointing precisely to the policies you mentioned before, but also to things like the EU reset deal. You know, Keir Starmer met Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, in the middle of the local elections when Reform was surging. Now, if your focus was simply how can we win over Reform voters, you wouldn't have done that. You would have said, Ursula, can we please move this to a less politically sensitive time? You know all about populists on the continent. But no, they did that because they thought it's good for the economy and jobs. And actually, you look at the electorate as a whole; they're pretty pro-European now. But I think the challenge is for how Labour can, on the one hand, address issues and concerns which some progressives are uncomfortable with without losing their political identity and keeping clear dividing lines, I think not just on the economy, but also on values.
Yeah. And we had a pollster come in, didn't we, Rachel, to sort of talk us through some of these numbers. And while it was clear that Labour has a lot more voters to lose to the left than they do to the right, seats-wise, it's not that simple.
So geographically, I think it was a rate of 2-1. So 2 votes that Labour loses to the left are the same amount of damage as 1 vote lost to Reform, because of the way those votes stack up geographically, urban centres or marginal seats. So that's a really important consideration. Another important consideration, I think, which we can get from polling, do you remember that Shattered Britain report? It came out in mid-July, More in Common, huge report on sort of British society and attitudes, but it broke the British electorate down into these 7 segments that all had, I love More in Common, but some of them had slightly strange names. Skeptical scrollers, disrupting dissidents or dissident disruptors, can't remember. Established liberals, etc., etc., etc. Progressive activists, I think, is the core group that this listener and the listener before and many of our listeners, that's probably how they would identify that kind of proudly progressive left kind of label. They're 12% of the electorate. That's small. It's not the smallest group, but it's sort of nowhere near a majority, obviously. And the thing about that segmentation that Ben Walker analysed in a really interesting piece just after that polling came out was 4 of those 7 segments are Reform friendly. 4 of them say that they would be most likely to vote for Reform than for any other party. So one thing that I think progressives who want the Labour Party to be more progressive should understand is there is an appetite for what reform is selling. Now, you can argue that that is to do with, we don't like any of the above options, we'll take a risk on something new. You can argue that it's about economic dissatisfaction as opposed to social or cultural dissatisfaction. There are lots of interesting underlying trends in that. But what you can't do is say that reform support is niche and an anomaly, and there is therefore no reason for a Labour government to be concerned by it. Yeah. There are far more reform curious voters than there are progressive activists, and that tension is something that anyone in the left-wing progressive space is going to have to confront if they want to succeed.